So by way of introduction, I just thought it's quite useful to think about why do we talk about systems, and it's something that maybe some people have heard a lot about, some people have heard less about, but certainly within Oxfam, maybe in the last few years, we've been talking more about it, and the reason I think that people are thinking about it and talking about it a lot more now than maybe they were a few years ago, is that it's really about the way that we do our work and the way we think about our work. So when I look at projects and plans from all over the world, sometimes I see some very straightforward things. So the simple step, if we do one thing, then there will be a single activity, or then there will be a single outcome. So, for example, we might say that if we link up buyers with farmers, then the farmers will be better off. And it's very sort of linear, one-step thinking. More often, and I would say usually, we actually understand that there are various different components that have to change to bring about a change in the particular aspect of poverty we're looking for. So we might, if we're thinking about smallholder agriculture, we might think about organising farmers into cooperatives or producer groups. We might also think about working with the food manufacturer to change the way they buy agricultural products. And we might have 3 or 4 things like that we work on all together to have a single outcome, which would be, let's say, increasing farmers' income. And so, as we're thinking in that more sophisticated way, we're actually doing the beginnings of what's called systems thinking or systems approaches. And the point that way of working recognises is that we know the world is very, very complicated. We know that a single input usually doesn't result in a single outcome. There's all sorts of different things that are connected, and if you change one of them, it has all sorts of impacts all over the place. So the world is much more complicated than some of our work suggests. So if we can move to the second slide. So this is a very scary diagram, and I don't want anyone to think that this kind of thing is what we should be aiming for. But the reason I'm showing you this is that I was at a workshop about 2 years ago, and a very, very good systems thinker had been working with some NGOs, some environmental NGOs. All of these environmental NGOs had been trying to work on the marine environment on the Pacific coast of Mexico. And for many years, some of these NGOs had been working for 20 years. And so this systems thinker started talking to them, and as he was talking to them, he started developing, just literally drawing on a chart, this systems diagram. And if you could press, just to advance the slide by 1, there's a few animations. So the first one is where it started. So he basically said, what effect do you want to have? And after some discussion, it was a very clear thing that in the case of Mexican fisheries, actually what we need is more big fish, because if you have more big fish, they reproduce, you get more small fish, you get a healthier ecosystem. So a very, very simple starting point. And from that, he then drew this, as he was talking, as he was holding a conversation with about 5 or 6 environmental NGOs, he started drawing this diagram you see in front of you. But the real revelation to me, and why I wanted to show you this diagram, was that those NGOs were essentially working on two things. Firstly, they're working on marine protected areas. So if you could press the slide again, marine protected areas, that bit of the diagram will come up. And the second bit, they were working on the allowable catch that each fisher family could have. Now, when you look at the system, those two things were exactly the hardest part of the system to change. So for 20 years, these NGOs who were very competent, very knowledgeable, very experienced in their field, had been working on the hardest part of the system. The green circle actually is the part of the system that if you want to bring about the outcome that these NGOs wanted to bring about, that would be the best place in the system to work. So by thinking about the system holistically, it became really clear that people had been working on the very hardest part of the system that they could to bring about the change they wanted. And obviously I don't work on marine fisheries, so I was an outsider in this conversation, but this got me thinking, well, maybe sometimes Oxfam and our partners and our allies, if we're not really understanding systems, maybe sometimes we are not working in the right way to bring about the change we want to make. So basically, to try to sort of give some definition around what we're talking about, systems thinking is a holistic approach because it recognises there are different components, and all of those components interrelate. It's about people, it's about institutions, it's about ecosystems, and so on. And all of these things interrelate with each other. So if you change one, you have impacts throughout the system. And it's different from our normal way of thinking about things and analysing things, which essentially breaks systems down into their separate elements and looks at the separate elements, where system thinking concentrates on the relationship between the different elements. So rather than understanding the element itself, it looks at the interrelationships. And much of what I'm saying, much about systems thinking, isn't new to any of you. Every time you've looked at the underlying causes of poverty and suffering and inequality, you've been applying systems thinking. Every time you've looked at the interrelationships between, say, the governance and institutions and poverty, or the interrelations between a market and farmers, then you've been applying parts of systems thinking. And really, all systems thinking does is provide us with a framework for doing that more systematically. So to the next slide, which shows Oxfam's market mapping approach. And this is, again, this is a sort of attempt to sort of bring systems thinking into our work around smallholders in value chains. And some of you will have used this kind of approach, which in the middle looks at the farm system and household system and how which are the producers and how that relates to the farmer enterprises, to traders, to processors, all the way through to consumers. And then above that, it has the enabling environment, things like the norms and behaviours around gender roles, things about natural environment, climate change, the sort of land rights that govern who can own what land, and other policies and institutions. And on the bottom, it has the kind of services that the producers rely on in order to be able to be farmers. Things like basic social services, access to education and healthcare. Things like extension services or access to credit and savings. So this is a kind of the kind of market map that, and kind of system that we work in, and we try to think about as a system in our work. This is getting close to the end of what I have to say. Is I think the value of thinking about systems is that it extends the boundaries of our work. So, for example, 10, 15 years ago, we started, in fact before that, let me go further back in Oxfam's history. Perhaps 20 years ago, we worked with smallholder farmers. We worked very much on helping them to produce more crops or better crops. But through doing that, we didn't really see a change in their poverty. They were still very poor. We realised maybe about 15 years ago that the reason that working just on production, just sort of being, as it were, an extension service, it wasn't working because it was ignoring other parts of the system. It was ignoring the fact that farmers are also businessmen. They sell their products into markets and they buy inputs from markets. And so we started using a markets-based approach, and we've then developed that further into what we call the gender and an gender enterprise and markets approach, GEM, which looks at markets, looks at production, but also begins to look at other parts of the system, household dynamics, and also environmental factors and climate change and risk. So that's a real-life example, if you like, of how Oxfam has taken a systems approach, and what that has done is it's expanded the boundaries of what we work on. So we don't just work with farmers on growing crops, we now work with farmers on a whole range of systemic issues which affect them. The second way that systems thinking can lead to better programs is that it can reduce the chances of unintended consequences. So if you understand the system, you can have a better understanding of when bad things might happen as a cause of your intervention. So if you understand the feedback loops, the interactions between different parts of the system, you can probably be a lot smarter about avoiding some unintended consequences of our work. The next point is that it's about identifying the most appropriate leverage points, and I gave an example of that from the Mexican fisheries, where the NGOs who've been working on the system for 20 years have been working on marine protected areas and regulations around allowable catch, whereas in fact the easiest way and the most profound way to change that system would have been through finding alternative livelihoods and additional livelihoods for fisher folk. And we have examples of that from the region, such as the work in Colombia around the urban and peri-urban linkages of the food market, where we found, and we thought about that as a system of different components, an urban component of consumers and a rural and peri-urban component of producers. And we thought about that as a whole system, and we thought about what are the leverage points that we can change in that system, so that there's greater food security in the urban areas, but there's also a greater income in the rural areas. And the final potential advantage of thinking about systems, thinking the systems way, is that it can bring about a bigger change, because rather than just making a change for those people living in poverty that we're directly working with, if you change a system, it can benefit all of the people living in poverty who are engaged in that system. So, for example, maybe 15 years ago we might have done market linkage projects where we would have tried to link a certain number of farmers with a particular market. But that only benefited those farmers. It didn't do anything to benefit farmers who were growing the same crops but who were in a physically different place, in different villages. And it didn't do anything to change the underlying factors that determined how difficult it was for these other farmers to sell effectively into markets. So if we think about a system and we change the system, the benefits can be much more widely felt. And to give an example, perhaps about 10 years ago, Oxfam started working on something called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which got all of the major stakeholders in the palm oil sector from Asia, also from Colombia, Brazil, and other countries in Latin America, and started thinking through what are the main environmental and social issues facing palm oil. Can we change those for the whole sector? Can we bring in standards to which everybody who sells into international markets, into the commodity market for palm oil, if they apply these standards, we can start changing the system. We can start changing the benefits for everybody who is involved in producing palm oil. So, potential for bigger change. And if we can move on to my last slide, some questions, because there are some questions I have. I've been talking very positively about systems thinking and the potential that systems thinking has to make our work more effective. But there are also some drawbacks. The first drawback is in that incredibly complicated picture that I showed you about Mexican fisheries, that actually probably nobody in Oxfam is ever going to be so good at systems thinking that we can really understand the system to that extent. The person who did that systems diagram, that systems analysis, was one of the world's top system thinkers. He works from MIT, which is one of the top academic institutions in the world. We're never going to be able to do that for every project and every program that we work on. So is it too complicated? That would be my first question. Second question would be, it maybe shifts our focus in a couple of ways, and are we happy with shifting the focus? Firstly, it would suggest that rather than be very preoccupied, as we have been as an organisation for a long time and as a whole sector, we've been so preoccupied with best practice in interventions. How best do we set up a cooperative? How best do we advocate for healthcare? Or how best do we bring about a change in a particular policy? Perhaps what system thinking says is actually really where we need to think about best practice is about how good our analysis is, how good our understanding of the system is. And if we understand the system well enough, then that will really suggest what the kind of interventions are, rather than us focusing our efforts on to constantly improve and refine specific types of intervention. The second sort of question, which is, I think, a really challenging one for all of us, is that if I look at NGO interventions of a particular type, say around smallholder agriculture, or around campaigning on the food system, wherever I look in the world, wherever they come from, these project plans or concept notes of funding, they all look very, very similar. That worries me, because one of the things about systems is they're going to be different everywhere. And if we're really analysing the system properly, I'm not sure that things should look the same wherever they go in the world they come from. And it suggests to me that perhaps a lot of the choices that we're making about the interventions we do and the programmes we design are perhaps based as much on ideology as they are on an analysis of the system and a real understanding of the system. And so if we emphasise systems thinking, perhaps that might mean that we have to discard some of the things that we are used to thinking are very important. So maybe actually in some contexts, cooperatives and producing organisations aren't the most important things. And maybe we have to say, if we understand the system properly and our analysis of the system is saying that that's not really the major intervention point, that we have to step back from that cooperative, collaborative action, and work on other parts of the system. Now that's only an example. It may be that in fact systems analysis of smallholder agriculture anywhere you are in the world would say that that is a major intervention point. But my point is a broader one really, that we might have to abandon some of the ideological positions we have if we really want to emphasise systems thinking and take the lessons of systems thinking about what they tell us the best interventions will be. So those are some of the questions I have, which I don't have an answer to. Thank you.